Arcane Ascension, Book 1, Chapter 1, Entry. It was the day of my judgment, and I was prepared in 1,000 ways that didn't matter. If I have a choice between tests, I'll pick a dialogue or mathematical challenge before accepting a combat challenge. In the unfortunate event that I'm stuck in a combat challenge, I'll try to run if there's anything bigger than a goblin, possibly even if it's a goblin, depending on how mean he looks. Spite traps are not my friends. Spite traps are the enemy. I will avoid them at all costs. I'd been training for this day for 5 years, since the day my brother, Tristan, had left for his own judgment. He'd entered the Serpent Spire, and like so many others, he'd never returned. Now, at 17, I stood among hundreds of my peers. They were waiting to try their luck. But I didn't trust luck. Luck wasn't reliable. Instead of relying on the fickleness of chance, I'd taken everything with me that I thought might help. Bringing weapons and armor into the test was strictly forbidden, but there weren't any rules about bringing a backpack full of supplies. I had double-checked, triple-checked. Maybe they'd consider my grappling hook a weapon, but crossing a downed bridge was one of the most common challenges, so I doubted it. My boots were more durable than the shoes my companions tended to wear and offered vastly better traction. Instead of a silken shirt, I wore a black leather doublet and pants. Not currently fashionable, but more likely to slow down a claw or blade. I'd studied too, but there was a limit to what I could learn from the experiences of others. After a judgment, the memories of the individual who took the test would rapidly fade, similar to waking from a dream. Some people held on to stronger memories than others. I read every book, essay, and scrap of paper that I could find with hints about what others had experienced. But nothing was reliable. Apparently Solis, our beneficent goddess, creator of this death trap tower and all the others, wanted to maintain a degree of mystery for newcomers. Even with all my preparation, I wasn't sure what my odds were of surviving the ordeal. From the grim expressions of my peers, I could tell some of them were running the same numbers in their heads that I was. Or maybe they were just intimidated by the sight of the spire. I'd seen the tower from a distance before, and I knew it was big, but that word wasn't close to describing it. Gigantic might have scratched the surface. Titanic, perhaps? I couldn't even see where it ended. The spire was roughly cylindrical in shape, constructed of dull blue stone I hadn't seen anywhere else. The circumference of the tower's base was nearly as impressive as the height. It eclipsed the size of any ordinary castle. Our scholars, military, and adventurers had spent years attempting to map the interior of the spire. Even their combined efforts barely covered a fraction of the estimated rooms within. This wasn't just due to the size. The spire's interior layout constantly changed, with rooms and passages appearing and disappearing on a daily basis. The gates of judgment were open wide, but it wasn't an inviting effect. With ogre-sized, jagged spikes of rock surrounding the entrance, it looked more like the tower had opened its jaws to swallow its victims whole. Most people were willing to risk entering the spire for a single reason. It was a chance to earn an attunement, a mark of Solis's favor. Every attunement brought power along with it, a fragment of the goddess's blessing. Some attuned could heal wounds with a touch. Others could hurl blasts of lightning. Every attunement extracted a cost, but that didn't stop anyone from trying to earn one. Father was attuned. Mother was attuned. Shouldn't it have been easy for Tristan to pass the same tests? Tristan had every advantage. As the firstborn, mother and father trained him endlessly, drilled him on their own experiences within the tower. No two judgments were identical, but common elements had been found. Physical challenges, puzzles, tests of intellect. He'd studied, prepared, and taken every mock test imaginable. He'd still failed. Mother left not long after that, and father insisted on personally providing me with additional training. After 2 years, he pulled me out of public school entirely. I'd been practicing dueling every day for the last 3 years. I had the scars to remind me. Father wanted to hone me into the perfect heir to the family's legacy, to earn the same attunement he had, the attunement our family was famous for. I didn't care about any of that. For me, earning an attunement was just one fraction of a longer-term plan. According to legend, the goddess would bestow a boon on anyone who is brave enough to reach the top of one of her spires. There were scattered stories of successes, heroes who had met the goddess and wished for wealth, power, or even to join her in the divine kingdom floating high above the world. I had no intention of trying to make it to the top of the tower right now. Earning my attunement was just the first step along my path, one that would give me the power necessary to begin my climb. It could take years to grow strong enough to reach the top of the spire, but I'd get there eventually, and I'd ask the goddess to give my brother back. It was the only way to bring my family back together. I was stopped by a pair of copper-armored guards just in front of the gate. Name? Corn Cadence. One of the guards moved a finger down a list until he found me, crossing out the name. I'll need to check your bag and papers. I handed him the papers first, and then the bag. For the guard, this must have been mundane, routine. For me, the stakes were a little more serious. I was about to risk my life, and no one I had met had even commented on that fact. No one had offered a single warning. My father hadn't even deigned to see me off at the train station. It seemed incongruous, given the time he'd spent preparing me. He probably decided I'd feel more confident doing this on my own. As usual, he was wrong. My hands trembled as I glanced to the entrance. I flinched as I watched the applicants in front of me fade into transparency, then nothingness as they crossed the threshold into the tower. It looked like they were disintegrating. Maybe they were. I wouldn't know until I tried. The guard handed my bag back to me. You can head on in. Thanks. I stepped up to the threshold. I knew what was going to happen next, but I didn't like it. No choice. I've come this far. I closed my eyes and stepped into the serpent's maw. Every inch of my exposed skin burned like I'd been out in the sun for days. Fortunately, keeping my eyes shut had spared them from sharing that sensation. Less fortunately, that hadn't prevented the nausea. My stomach reacted next, and I pitched over to vomit on the gray stone floor. My eyes fluttered open after my meager lunch abandoned me. I stood in the middle of a chamber of white stone. A bright glow illuminated the room with no discernible source. The room was circular, maybe 30 feet in diameter. At the center was a formation of waist-height pillars. I counted 12 in total. Each pillar had a single object atop it. My first challenge, my first choice. The room had 3 discernible exits, and I glanced at them before I took any further steps. One was straight across from me, the others 90 degrees to either side. I turned around briefly, but there was no exit door, just as I had been warned. The doors themselves were etched with similar runes to the ones that had guarded the tower itself. They each had a single central symbol, a circle with a colorful crystal within. The gems were blue, yellow, and red from right to left. The books I had studied had mentioned similar doors. Opening a door was as simple as touching the gem, but various authors speculated that the colors had some significance. Most believed that red was the path of violence, for example. I'd worry about that part after I figured out what I was doing here. I stepped toward the center of the room. The pillars made a smaller circle within the chamber, spread equidistant from one another. The objects on the pillars were generally easy to identify. A key, golden, with a wing motif. A scroll, sealed with wax. A book, roughly as thick as my closed fist. I paused there, taking a closer look at the book. The cover was leather, more in the style of a personal journal than a textbook. There was no writing on the surface. Interesting. I'll need to take a closer look at this later. I walked over to the next section of items. The first item that caught my eye was a ruby statue of Katashi, the visage of valor. Interesting, because Katashi was not the visage typically associated with this spire. That'd be Tenjin, the visage of inspiration. The next pedestal appeared to be empty. Suspicious. The third had a quill, the tip dripping with ink. No corresponding inkwell. A magic quill, maybe? Maybe the quill is meant to be paired with the book. I walked to the next section, noting that these pillars all held weapons. A sword with an ornate bronze hilt, sheathed. a dueling cane in an unfamiliar style, a firearm. I struggled to think of the specific name, but I had only heard of them in books. It had a long barrel and a container of metallic balls next to it. I was surprised to see one, given their rarity on this side of the continent. The final three pillars all held wearable items. A dueling vest, the cloth etched with runes. A shield, wood-lined with metal. A circlet studded with numerous gemstones. I didn't see any runes etched into it, so I didn't think it was enchanted, but I wasn't exactly an expert on magic. Not yet, anyway. Well, this isn't exactly the death trap I was expecting. I'd never heard of a room like this before. Maybe most people didn't count it as a test? That seemed doubtful. My understanding was that every movement I made within the spire was being evaluated. So I got an unusual starting room. That was fine. I'd heard about rooms with items in them before, just not this particular layout. Generally, taking items was safe. Generally. Maybe it was a test of greed. Was I supposed to leave everything behind? Or maybe just take a single item? I shook my head. I could guess indefinitely without coming up with an answer. I took a closer look at the platforms themselves, examining them for anything unusual. Hidden panels, clues, or switches. The goddess loved that sort of thing. So they said, at least. I didn't find any, which was deeply worrying. Time to prioritize, then. I knew there was a good chance something would happen when I picked up the first item. Perhaps a trap would trigger somewhere, or the other items would vanish. Assuming this equipment was meant to be taken, what did I need the most? The key could be, well, a key to my success, or totally worthless. The scroll was the same. It could easily be a map to the dungeon, or some esoteric notes on mathematical theory. The book had the same degree of binary promise. The next set didn't impress me, although I did strongly consider touching the empty pedestal to see if it triggered anything. Maybe I was supposed to put something on it? Sacrifice something of value in exchange for what I was taking? I'd do that if I had a chance, I decided. And if I happened to dislodge an invisible object in the process, all the better. Weapons. Yeah, those could be useful. This place was riddled with monsters, and I wasn't allowed to bring a weapon inside. Maybe the goddess knew I'd need a way to fight. Or maybe I'd only run into monsters if I took a weapon. It was broadly speculated that the configuration of the tower reacted to choices in any given room. The next section was the wearables. The dueling vest was extremely tempting. The runes on the surface made it resistant to damage from both physical attacks and weak magical ones. Depending on the density of the runes, a vest could typically handle between 1 and 3 hits before needing repairs. This one looked to be high quality. Ultimately, my curiosity made my decision for me. I put my hand on the empty pedestal, groping for an invisible object, and then feeling along the surface. Nothing happened. I opened my backpack next, going through my stuff. An unlit candle, a piece of flint, and a tiny metal rod for striking it, food, water, a handful of coins, a roll of bandages, and a coil of rope. The handful of coins amounted to the majority of my personal wealth, and the single gold coin most of that. I put the coin on the pedestal. Again, no obvious reaction from the room. I left it there anyway, moving to the pedestal with the key. Flexing my hands in the air, I took a deep breath and then snatched it. Again, nothing. Sometimes a pedestal was just a pedestal, I supposed. I wasn't going to take any chances. I dropped the key into my bag and then put one of my lesser coins in the place the key had been. The key was my first priority because I didn't think anything here would be useless. Celise was difficult to predict, but scholars agreed that she was generally fair. Everything here would have value, either within the tower or outside it. Possibly both. I needed whatever was most likely to be relevant here, and the key topped that list, followed by the quill and the scroll. Everything else was likely to have at least some value outside of the spire, and thus would not necessarily need to have any use within it. The hardest choice was determining if I wanted to take a weapon, with the knowledge that the choice might influence the challenges to come. My father would have wanted me to pick up a weapon, to push for combat tests as much as possible. Our family had made our name in battle. He was a shaper like his father and his grandfather. If I didn't at least make an effort to carry on the family tradition, I knew he'd be ashamed of me. But I loathed hurting people. I always had. I trained with my father for years, and I enjoyed the rush of sparring as much as anyone. But in those rare moments I'd managed to hurt him, or anyone else, I'd shut down. Father thought that made me weak. Maybe he was right, but it didn't change anything. There was something I feared more than hurting others, however, and that was failing my brother. Finding him was something I was willing to fight for. I picked up the dueling cane and examined the surface. The weapon was a metallic rod about the length of my forearm. The grip was black crystal inscribed with runes that would conduct my internal essence into the weapon. I adjusted my grip so that my thumb hovered over a button, presumably the trigger. I found a switch on the opposite end, which most likely would deploy the foot-long metallic blade within. My own dueling canes had always been purely runic, the trigger mechanisms based on touching a rune and the application of focused thought. I was not an attuned. I had no magical abilities of my own, but anyone could use a dueling cane with sufficient practice. And I had practiced, and practiced. A runic weapon like this would tear mana from the inside of the wielder's body, using it to power a blast of energy if the cane was in its default state, or to charge the blade with energy if the weapon had been deployed. Duelists learned to quickly switch between states to use the melee and ranged functions. A single blast from a cane was often enough to incapacitate an unarmored target. Thus, dueling vests were used. I took the dueling vest too and slipped it on. I replaced both the weapon and armor with coins. Having already taken 3 items, I couldn't resist taking a little bit more, even knowing the ever-growing risk. I took the book and the scroll, again replacing them with coins. I really hoped the goddess liked coins. The dueling cane's mechanical parts bothered me. It was an unusual design, foreign. I flipped the switch on the back and it deployed a blade as I expected. I had to push the switch back in and pull it down to get the blade to retract, which was an annoyance. It was most likely spring-loaded. Well, I'd adapt. The weapon had a small clip on the bottom designed to attach to clothing, which I used to secure it on my belt. I'd draw the cane the instant I sensed any chance of combat. I flipped open the book. It appeared to be blank. A puzzle? I'd worry about it later. I put the book away. I broke the seal on the scroll next, unrolling it. On the positive side of things, this had writing on it. Unfortunately, it wasn't in a language I could read. Valdaric, maybe? I wasn't a linguistics expert. I rolled it up and shoved it in my pack, mildly irritated. I briefly considered whether or not the quill was meant to be used in conjunction with the blank book. I had no way of knowing, really. 1 quill exchanged for 1 coin. A good deal for the goddess as far as I was concerned. Maybe this whole tower thing was just an excuse to rob 17-year-olds of their hard-earned savings. I doubted it, but who could know for sure? I approached the blue door first. Blue was a nice, safe, tranquil color. It also was generally assumed to be associated with mental traits, and I figured I had the best chance of surviving mental puzzles. I touched the gem. The door rumbled, sliding down into a depression in the ground. The next room was square-shaped, and in the midst of it, a smaller square divided into a grid. There were 3 doors on the opposite side of the room, each with a different color of gem. Purple, green, and, maybe indigo? Each of the grid squares near the center had a color-coded tile, and each tile had a foreign symbol within. I really hate color-coded tile puzzles. I read a lot about this style of puzzle, and even tried a few practice ones. I was terrible at them. I stepped away from the door, shaking my head. It closed without any further interaction from my part. I walked over to the red door and opened it. It showed a long, narrow hallway, wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. I could see the door on the opposite end, but just barely. In the middle of the path, however, was a monster.
The world's most adorable monster. It looked like a big house cat with gray and white stripes, sitting with its front paws raised. It had 3 long, bunny-like ears and a trailing rat-like tail. It tilted its head to the side as it saw me, giving me a quizzical expression. It was too cute to die. I stepped away from the door, chuckling to myself. It's possible I am the world's worst adventurer. 1 door left. The red door slid shut as I headed to the yellow and touched the final gem. The last room was square, about 20 feet across, the same size as the first one I had opened. This one was divided into smaller squares too, but in a very different way. A solid third of the squares were missing. From my vantage point in the doorway, I could see nothing below the gaps in the floor but darkness. I assumed, to be safe, that it would be certain death if I fell in one of those holes. Directly across from me, blocking one of the room's 3 exit doors, was a mirror. It was taller than I was and nearly twice as wide.
This seemed like the most appealing option. Visible pit traps didn't worry me anywhere near as much as stepping on the wrong tile in some kind of color puzzle. I didn't step into the yellow room. Not immediately. First, I needed to map those squares. The left and right half of the room were almost symmetrical. Not quite, but it took some observation to spot the differences in the paths. 2 paths led to 2 doors on opposite ends of the room. The third door had only a single square of floor in front of it, with no solid path to it. I'd have to jump or otherwise problem solve to make it to that one. The doors were, of course, also color-coded. The green door was the isolated one, on my left. Orange was on my right. Gold in the center. 2 were clearly combinations of the colors from the first room, and I had seen green as an option in the room with the colored squares. Would both green doors lead to the same place? I wasn't sure, and it wasn't easily testable, since I knew there was a good chance the door I used to enter this chamber was going to vanish the moment I walked in. The goddess disapproved of backtracking, apparently. The room seemed too simple at a glance. The mirror probably had some kind of function that wasn't obvious from a distance. Maybe some of the tiles were illusory, and some of the gaps were actually solid, and I'd have to look in the mirror to see the true path. That seemed like a valid puzzle, and it scared me a lot less than the colored tiles. It scared me more than the cat-rat-bunny, but I really wanted to avoid killing something without cause. I scanned the room for anything I might tie my rope for a lifeline if I fell. No handrails, no obvious protrusions from the floor. Just squares, some empty, some apparently safe. And the mirror, of course. I had brought a lot of rope, nearly 50 feet, coiled up, high quality. The tower was notorious for having pits, many of which would be fatal. I tied one end of the rope around my waist with a climbing knot. I prepped the other side of the rope as a crude lasso, took a deep breath, and stepped inside. As I expected, there was no exit when I turned around. I did not, however, expect the shadowy simulacrum of myself that appeared in front of the mirror. Oh, Rish, that's bad. I raised my rope, preparing to throw it at the mirror. The duplicate copied my motions exactly, holding an identical rope. Ah, the killer shadow that mirrors what I do puzzle. A classic. I slid my foot forward, not taking a full step in case the ground in front of me was illusory. Fortunately, the next square proved as solid as it appeared. The shadow creature mirrored my movement. I waved. It waved. "Hi," I said. Even if I knew it was going to try to kill me, there was no need to be rude. It opened its mouth, mirroring me, but no sound emerged. Creepy. There was nothing overtly dangerous about the duplicate, but I was confident bad things were going to happen if it got too close, or possibly if I took too long in solving whatever I was supposed to solve. I continued to slide my foot, moving to the right side of the room. I wanted a clear throw at the mirror with my rope,
without the shadow throwing a rope in my direction. I had no idea what a shadow rope might do if it hit me, or how the shadow would react if it touched my own rope. Once I was in position, I threw the rope at the mirror. And missed. The shadow mirrored me, throwing its own rope, with equally useless results. I threw the rope a second time, missing again. The tile that I had stood on when I entered the room broke away from the others, plunging into the darkness below. Oh, rish me, I have a time limit. I finished reeling in the rope, tossed it lazily over my shoulder, and pulled the dueling cane off my belt. The shadow mirrored me. If I fired at him, he'd probably fire something back at me.
I didn't know if the shadow cane would produce a projectile, but if it did, it might be more dangerous than my own. I aimed at the mirror instead, pressing the button. I felt a familiar tingling as the cane siphoned mana from my arm, channeling it into the weapon's core and expelling it as a blue-white burst of arcane force. The bolt slammed into the mirror and, predictably, bounced right back at me. I didn't have time to dodge. I raised both arms in a defensive stance, and the blast crashed into my forearms. The force of the burst knocked me backward, leaving one of my feet dangling just over the edge of a fatal fall. I leaned forward, falling on my knees and elbows to avoid a descent into the pit. It was only at that point that I processed what my duplicate had done. Its own projectile had been silent and nearly invisible. Tracing the path from the creature's dueling cane, however, I could see a hole in the wall, burrowing nearly 3 feet into the stone. That was a dozen times more force than I could muster, and more than enough to overwhelm my dueling vest's protection. I couldn't take this thing in a blasting fight. Breathing deeply, I pushed myself to my feet. Another tile fell into the darkness. I marched forward, following the path toward the central door, my eyes following the shadow. It mirrored me, but the room wasn't symmetrical. When I neared the middle of the room, I found the spot I was looking for. A space where I could move forward safely, but a single step would plunge the shadow into the darkness below. I stepped forward. My duplicate didn't. Instead, it raised its cane toward me. I ran. Gah! Stupid shadow, not following the rules! The blast ripped through the air behind me as I rushed for the mirror, taking cover behind it. I could see 3 options if the shadow fired at me. The mirror would reflect the blast, the mirror would break and destroy the shadow, or the mirror would break and the shadow would be fine. 2 out of 3 options led to my survival, and I was good with that. It was, unfortunately, impossible to see what the shadow was doing if I was fully concealed behind the mirror, and I had limited time to act. I raised my cane, listening. The creature made no sound. I can't outfight this thing. I need to outthink it. I might make it if I rush for the door, but I might not. I could try to hold out here until the shadow falls, but there's a good chance it would come around the side of the mirror and annihilate me before then. Maybe I could fire a distracting shot one way and then go around the other? Too risky. High odds it's tied to the mirror somehow, given the theme of the room. What am I doing here? I can test one hypothesis right now. I pressed my cane against the wooden back of the mirror and hit the switch for the spring-loaded blade. The blade pierced through the mirror, splintering wood and glass, and the creature wailed in agony. Apparently, it could make sound. I grabbed the cane with both hands, dragging downward as my shadow circled around the mirror. As my weapon tore through the mirror, the shadow's chest was torn apart. I stood, yelling as I ripped the weapon upward, cutting through the top of the mirror. I bisected the shadow. It fell to the ground, inert. I shivered as I watched it, trying to push the guilt from my mind. It wasn't real. It's just an illusion, a figment created by the mirror. I wasn't certain of that, but I tried to convince myself as best I could. I slammed a shoulder into the mirror, but it didn't fall. That was fine. I retracted the blade, rushing for the golden door.
Maybe I had time to explore. Maybe I didn't. I didn't like my odds if I waited.
I touched the golden gem, revealing a room with a glass table and two glass chairs in the center. There was a board on the table with glass figures atop it. Valor, if I wasn't mistaken. Good enough. I stepped inside. Chapter 2. Valor. The door vanished behind me, of course. I pondered the significance of the door's color for a moment. Was the golden gem just representing a more challenging version of the same style of room? Or maybe these colors had some sort of cultural significance. The room could represent the tyrant in gold, for example. If it did, I was probably in a great deal of trouble. I carefully inspected the floor before I made my way forward. The square-shaped grid wasn't present here, and I didn't see any runes or indentations. There were, however, 4 small grates in the corners of the room. They looked inert for now, but I didn't like the look of them. The Valor board was the most obvious set piece for a puzzle. I ignored it and headed straight toward the 3 doors in the back of the room. Green, gold, and orange. Just like the last room. I didn't know how many rooms I'd have to complete in total, but I'd planned to stick with gold unless I saw a good reason to switch. Especially if I could skip the puzzle entirely. I moved my hand toward the golden gem, but pulled it back at the last second. There was a keyhole above the gem. I frowned and checked the other doors. They were all set up in the same way. Okay, I could deal with that. Maybe. I had a key, but I didn't know if it would fit. I headed back to the gold door, unslung the rope that was still awkwardly hanging over my shoulder, and set down my backpack. The first thing I noticed was that the rope was a lot shorter than when I had started. I'd lost the looped section, as well as over a dozen feet of length. Maybe it had been nicked by one of the blasts from my shadowy rival, or maybe it had been bisected when I stepped through the doorway into the next room. That was a scary thought. I had known the doorways were actually teleporting me, but I hadn't considered what would happen if I trailed something behind me. Could that be used to my advantage? Maybe I could use the doorways offensively in later challenges somehow. A good thing to keep in mind for the future. I undid the knot around my waist and folded up the rope, emptying out my backpack to put the remaining rope back on the bottom. When I was removing the book, though, I noticed something odd. On the cover, Trials of Judgment was now written in an antiquated style. I flipped the book open and gawked at what I saw. The first 2 pages had been written in. This is the room of reflection. Move swiftly. Any tile you stand upon too long will fall into the void below. The mirror poses a grave danger. Avoid showing your reflection. I really wished I had seen that earlier, but honestly, I wasn't sure I would have had time to read it even if I had known the hint was there. Was that the book's function? Hints for each room? If so, it was incredibly valuable. I flipped to the next page. This is the Room of Valor. Complete the game to advance. Beware the rising mist. I frowned. Mist? What mist? Oh, the stuff that was rising from the grates on the side of the room. I knew I hated those. I dug for the key and kept it in my left hand while I buried the other items in my pack. I considered trying it on the doors immediately. Maybe it was a way to bypass the puzzle. If it was, however, I suspected I'd only be able to use it once. According to legend, at least, the goddess didn't like people reusing the same solutions. I would rather save it if I could. I moved to the table, keeping the key close at hand. The mist was rising, but not particularly rapidly. I guessed I'd have at least a few minutes before it got high enough that I'd be breathing much of it in. Of course, if it was acid mist or something, I'd need to act a lot sooner. I played a lot of Valor in my youth. It was a fairly standard game of tactics, common in noble households like my own. Each side started with 20 pieces, many of which had different functions. Based on what I'd read, I assumed I'd be playing against the tower itself. If the tower played like an average civilian, I'd have a good chance. If the tower played like my childhood companion Sarah, well, I'd have better luck inhaling the mist. The Valor board was stone, and the figures atop it were forged from red and blue gems. The board was in a standard starting configuration, save for a single missing piece on the red side. The ruby statue from the first room, I realized. If I had taken that,
I'd have one more piece to play, assuming I sat on the red side of the table. I sat down on the blue side, which was opposite from the entrance. It was unintuitive, but I hadn't been given any instructions. Nothing said I had to take the side with a disadvantage. My hand shook as I reached for the first piece. The mist was rising. How long did a game of Valor usually take? A half hour, maybe, against a new opponent? Maybe a little less, if the enemy was missing a key piece. 15 minutes. I didn't have that kind of time. I reached across the table for the red side and systematically removed each of their pieces from the board, with the exception of their goddess. Then, I moved my own visages into pincer positions around the enemy goddess. She was pinned. The game was won. A red key appeared in the center of the table. I cheered aloud, shamelessly. Cheating? Nah, I was just playing to win. I picked up the red key, heading for the gold door. I knew even before I tried it that the key wasn't going to fit. Apparently, brute forcing a victory on the board earned me a specific type of key, not access to any room I wanted. My winged key from the first room was gold. Would it work on the golden door? Probably, but I still wanted to save it for an emergency. I knew the orange door might take the red key.
I hadn't been into an orange room, though, and I wasn't sure if it would have a gold exit as an option, meaning my gold key might be useless if I headed on that path. If I continued down the gold path, however, I was likely to continue to see orange doors. It was a safer option. I tried the golden key in the lock for the golden door. It twisted in place with a click. I retrieved the key successfully and then touched the gem. The door slid open. The next room was fairly straightforward. I could see 3 doors on the opposite side of a yawning chasm that covered 2/3 of the chamber. A standard chasm challenge. The door gems on the opposite side of the room were the same colors as the ones in the current chamber, confirming the pattern. The chasm wasn't fathomless this time. I saw water maybe 20 feet below where I stood. There was a ladder on the opposite side of the room, leading out of the water and up to the side with the doors. I also saw 2 blocks with what looked like levers embedded in them. Presumably, those were switches to make a bridge across the water. Metal poles were anchored into the walls. There were 2 on each side, spanning the entire chasm. They were a few inches out from the wall, and it looked like I could potentially grab onto one and walk on the other. It was probably an alternate way to traverse the gap for someone with a lot of dexterity. Since I was able to successfully retrieve my key, it dispelled a bit of my paranoia about the keys being single-use. I still couldn't be confident it would always be like that, but it meant I could probably do a little more testing without being overly worried about losing my keys. Before heading into the room with the chasm, I walked to the orange door to test my hypothesis about the red key. The mist was at nearly waist level now, so I didn't want to take much longer. The rising vapor was chilly, but didn't burn my skin or anything, and I wasn't feeling any obvious symptoms from it. I turned the key in the lock. It clicked into place. Apparently, red keys and orange doors were compatible. I retrieved the key and opened the door. The chamber in front of me was gigantic. Looking up from the doorway, I could see up hundreds of feet, with no indication of a ceiling above. A gigantic eye stared at me from the opposite side of the room. It was perhaps 50 feet away and 3 times my height. By that, I mean that the eye was 3 times my height. Just the eye. The monster it was attached to? Well, I couldn't get a good look at it from my vantage point, but it was the sort of size you counted in floors, not feet. I did see azure shield-like scales around the eye, though, and that gave me a good idea of what I was looking at. Seiryū, the god serpent, guardian of the serpent spire. It was looking right at me. I stepped away from the door, allowing it to close, and rushed into the chasm room. I never considered myself a coward. I didn't think of myself as very brave, either. When seeing a god beast, though, my level of bravery was largely irrelevant. No sane mortal would have lingered another moment in that creature's sight. I only hoped it wouldn't follow me. If it did, no walls, no teleportation to other rooms, and no degree of prayer would save me. Inside the chasm room, I forced my eyes shut, taking deep breaths. I'd been scared before, of course, but seeing the sheer scale of that thing, knowing that it could annihilate me effortlessly, it made me feel smaller, insufficient. What am I doing here? I shook my head, clearing my mind. I had work to do. I glanced around the room, getting a better look now that I was inside. The challenge seemed fairly straightforward, but first impressions could be deceptive. The floor wasn't divided into tiles, which was good. I didn't want to have to take a circuitous route. I took a few steps closer, nearing the chasm itself. The water started only a few feet below where I was standing. It looked deep, but not insurmountably so. I could see a stone floor maybe around 20 or so feet down. No signs of monsters in the water, but I did see a large grate on my own side that could hide something behind it. Horrible apparitions, maybe, or treasure. It was too easy. Maybe the room was designed to give me a chance to rest, but it didn't fit what I knew of Celise. One of the goddess's many titles was the Mistress of Trials, and it was well known that she enjoyed providing mortals with escalating challenges. She was a gambler of a goddess, and she expected her followers to follow her example. So what was the gamble here? Would the obvious handholds on the side break away from the wall, sending me into the water below? That was underwhelming. I mean, I just made it through 2 rooms that were almost undoubtedly lethal. I wasn't far from the water, so I pulled the dueling cane off my belt and extended it, reaching down to tip the metal blade into the liquid below. There was no obvious reaction when it touched the surface of the pool, so I withdrew the weapon and ever so carefully set it down. I opened my backpack, pressing the top of the quill against the wet metal. No telltale burning. I leaned down and sniffed, and the liquid didn't smell like much of anything. Finally, I gingerly pressed a finger on my left hand against the liquid. Nothing. Ordinary water as far as I could tell. If it wasn't acid, what was I dealing with? Just a time limit, maybe? The backpack was already out, so I opened the book. When I flipped to the next page, I saw something new. Fresh writing. The text appeared as I watched. This is the room of false choices. That was it. No further explanation, no detail. In a moment of frustration, I removed the quill from my bag and wrote a reply on the same page. There was plenty of blank space. Each room started on a new one. Dear mysterious book entity, I would like to inquire about more details pertaining to the room of false choices. Would you, perhaps, deign to provide me with insight on how best to proceed? Yours in inquiry, Corin of the House Cadence. I chuckled, dispelling some of the lingering fear from my own mind. Absurdity had always been an excellent shield against the threat of negative emotions. I did not expect a reply. Dear Corin, may I call you Corin? There's no need to be sarcastic, but it's been so long since anyone has written me, or in me. I suppose I can offer you a glimmer of such insight. Provided you're not blind, you can currently see 3 doors from the entry of your room. Those are options for exiting your chamber, but they are not the best ones. As much as I am enjoying our correspondence, I must encourage you to hurry. Even as you read, your true choices begin to fade. Yours in useful insight, mysterious book entity. I stared blankly at the now filled text. What? The reply had filled the remainder of that page and carried on to the next. I wasn't sure what that would mean for help in the next room, but for the moment, I had bigger concerns. I stowed the book and the quill. I was, apparently, wasting time. So the puzzle was figuring out the real exit, or exits. My mind immediately went to the grate within the pool. That seemed accessible if I felt like diving in, which, at present, I didn't. I checked the walls on my side next. Were there any hidden panels, signs of secret doors? I didn't find anything immediately, but I did get a new idea. I tossed my backpack right back down, grabbing the book and quill and transcribing the text. Dear mysterious book entity, I'm looking for someone named Tristan Cadence. He entered the tower 5 years ago, and he may or may not currently be alive. I would be immensely grateful if you could tell me anything about what happened to him. Thank you. Corin. I stared at the book with growing nervousness for several moments before I saw the reply. Dear Corin, you shouldn't be asking me about that right now. You should be more concerned about surviving this room. Yours, Mysterious Book Entity. I sighed, putting my things away. More time lost. I eyed the switches on the other side. What would they do? One of them had the switch side facing toward me. The other was facing the opposite direction. Interesting. I heard some kind of clicking noise somewhere, and then a loud scraping that traveled across the entire right wall of the room. Resh, I really hope that isn't the god beast looking for me. Okay, calm. Let's hit those switches. I had enough rope to reach the other side of the chasm, but I didn't trust myself to lasso one of the switches in a timely fashion. I chose to lift the dueling cane and aim it carefully at the switch on the right, pressing my thumb against the button. The blast ripped forward, striking true, and snapping the top half of the switch right off. Apparently, those things weren't very sturdy. 3 options left in my mind: a lasso, a swim, and the bars on the sides. I went with a lasso. I didn't trust that water in the slightest. My first attempt to catch one of the switches missed. The second time, the rope landed in the water, soaking through. That added weight made it harder to throw, but easier to control. I managed to encircle the switch that was facing away from me. With a yank, I pulled it toward me. The water began to drain from the pool, which was great in one respect. The water terrified me. Less great was that a comfortable 4-foot drop into water was now swiftly becoming a 24-foot fall into a pair of broken legs. I had a decision to make, and quickly. I dropped the rope and rushed for the nearest wall, where the handholds were, and grabbed on tight. Pulling hard, I determined that the hold seemed sturdy. Then I made my way across the chasm, hand over hand. The entire room rumbled as I moved, nearly sending me tumbling into the diminishing water below. I wanted to fall sooner rather than later if I was going to. There was enough water left to serve as a cushion, but it wasn't going to last much longer. Of course, I didn't want to fall at all. Even if that liquid was really water and not acid, I didn't know what other dangers lay within. Maybe a monster would come out of that grate as soon as the water drained, or acid would rise from the floor. One hand in front of the other. Twice, I lost the grip with one of my hands and had to haul myself back into position, but I made it across. I walked over to the other switch, the one I had broken, and pushed the remaining half of the handle. Back where I had made my entrance, 3 doors appeared with gems of black, silver, and bronze coloring. I didn't have the faintest idea what those meant. My arms ached. I felt something on my head. Dust or tiny rocks crumbling from the ceiling above me. That rumbling wasn't illusory. The room was beginning to collapse. I turned back to the chasm. The water was nearly gone now. I had hoped one of the switches would provide a bridge, but that was clearly too much to ask for. Did I trust my arms to carry me back across the chasm to the new doors? The book had hinted that the exits nearest me were suboptimal solutions, but it didn't imply they'd be deadly. I might be better off taking the easy route out and testing myself in the next room. I found myself making my way over to the pit's edge, but not to cross it. Instead, I gripped the ladder, slowly climbing down. I needed to know what was behind that grate. The ladder was steel, slippery from contact with the water, but embedded in the wall similar to the handrails. It was sturdy and easy to climb. I tested a foot against the ground before dropping off the ladder entirely. The floor itself seemed solid, and I didn't see any signs of other traps. I made my way to the grate. It was taller than I was and blocked by iron bars. I saw a keyhole on the right side of the gate, but it wasn't marked with any specific color, nor was there a gem like on the doors above. Beyond the bars, I could see only darkness. I stuck the back of the quill through the bars first. It came back perfectly intact. The blackness wasn't some kind of annihilating field, at least. I slowly tried a finger next. There was no pain, no wetness, nothing uncomfortable. The floor rumbled. This may not be a gem-studded door, but I think it qualifies as a non-standard exit. I readied the dueling cane, stepped back, and blasted the bars off the gate. I had chosen my exit. I stepped into the dark. Chapter 3. Limited Options. I was immensely relieved when I found myself standing in an illuminated tunnel. The walls hugged close around me. The tunnel was roughly cylindrical and barely wider than I was. I turned around, finding a circular door behind me. There was no obvious lock, just a clear gemstone at the center. Interesting. I opened the door immediately. It led into a hexagonal chamber with pristine white walls. The walls were somewhat less important than the massive pendulums swinging back and forth throughout the room. I was barely quick enough to step back before one of them swished out of the doorway. I'd been inches away from being pulverized. The swinging spheres were solid stone, maybe 4 feet in diameter, and moving fast enough to pulp me. Odd that the trap swung outside of the door. I've never seen one of the traps exit the boundary of a room before. What was it doing before I walked in? Did the pendulums activate when I approached? Or was that sphere slamming into the door before I opened it? I didn't hear anything hitting the wall, but it could be covered in soundproofing runes. Now out of the pendulum's swinging range, I took a deep breath and looked at the room a bit more closely. 5 different pendulums, and for variety, a scythe-like blade swinging near the center. Each pendulum had a different trajectory, one more swinging in parallel on the left side of the room, 2 swinging perpendicular to the first, located on the right side of the room. One final pendulum swinging diagonally near the rear of the left side. More interestingly, there were square-shaped crystalline sections on various parts of the walls, roughly 4 feet across. A blue one on the ceiling, a red one on the right wall, and a yellow one on the floor below where one of the pendulums were swinging. No doors, aside from the entrance. The crystalline sections were presumably the exits. Evaluating the speed of the swinging balls of doom, I figured I could make it out of the doorway and onto the right side of the room between swings if I really wanted to. I really didn't. I stepped further away from the door, allowing it to close. The pendulum cracked against the door a moment later, and I shuddered at the sound of the impact. Fortunately, the door remained intact. I didn't see any signs of damage on my side of it either. I decided I'd consider this a potential exit route, but I was interested in seeing what was at the end of the hall. Also, I was even more interested in not getting stuck in a room filled with whirling death traps. The hall was long enough that I managed to slip my dueling cane back on my belt and unsling my backpack to remove the book before I reached the end of it. I skipped to the last section with writing. You shouldn't have done that. I blinked. I put the book away. The path terminated at a rectangular chamber, and I could immediately see why the book had been concerned. First, there was the dead body. Blood pooled around a corpse in the center of the chamber, some of it looking congealed. The victim was a man around my age, dressed in fancy clothes. His most distinctive characteristic was the hole in his chest, roughly the size of my fist. It went straight through his body, as perfectly cylindrical as the hallway I emerged from. He wasn't the only one there, however. At the back of the room were 3 smaller chambers constructed from some sort of transparent material, likely a type of glass or crystal. Each chamber held a single person. 2 of them were looking at me. The chamber on the far right held a woman in her 20s, leaning forward against the transparent wall. I barely heard the banging. Something seemed to be dampening the sound. She wore garb I'd associate with a traveling merchant, a lot of pouches, a couple necklaces, and heavy boots and gloves. From her dark brown skin, I assumed she was Kalish. After a moment, she knocked on the wall, frowning at me. The central chamber held a black-haired man wearing a silver eye mask. The exposed section on the bottom of his face was light-skinned and clean-shaven, the latter point implying that he was either relatively young or hadn't been in the cell for very long. He leaned against the back wall of the chamber, his arms folded. The hint of a long-sheathed weapon, most likely a sword, was visible beneath his ornate overcoat. My heart stopped for an instant when I looked at him. The masked man looked almost like my brother. Tristan had seemed taller, but I'd been 12 years old when he'd left. Maybe that was just my memories playing a trick. Their weight and build were about right. The figure in the cell looked a bit more athletic, but 5 years was a long time to potentially put on some muscle. His hair was too dark, too long, but that could be explained by hair dye and the passage of time. His skin was too light, but maybe he was sick from all this time in a cell. I shook my head. The similarities were enough to trigger painful memories, but the differences were too pronounced. I wanted it to be my brother in there, but it wasn't him. I'd have to find Tristan later. On the far left was another prone figure, a boy. He looked a few years younger than me. His skin was even darker than the young woman's, nearly pitch black. His head was shaved, and he had an extensive web-like tattoo in white ink across his forehead. No pool of blood around him, fortunately. Upon seeing the woman continue to pound on the wall, I realized what I was seeing. Prison cells. They were trapped inside, and someone, possibly their jailer, was dead right outside. Disconcerting. I frowned, moving toward the corpse. The masked man raised a single hand while I approached, giving a curt shake of his head. Was the body a trap? Or was he just saying that it was far too late for the victim? Or maybe he didn't want me to know how the man had been killed. I glanced around the room, looking for anything vaguely cylindrically shaped on the walls. I didn't find anything of the kind, but I did find a hexagonal panel on the floor, not far from where the man had fallen. Was the dead man a candidate like me, someone who had stumbled upon the jail? Resh. Carefully, I went to the body, ignoring the masked man. I avoided the hexagonal shape, glancing from side to side as I knelt. The woman who had been pounding on the wall gave me a curt nod. I took that as a sign that I was safe to continue, reached down, and rolled the body toward me. I heard a click. I jumped backward just in time to avoid the spear of light that flashed across the room from left to right, flickering and fading as it hit the opposite wall. Shuddering where I stood, I looked down, finding a small depressed tile beneath the body I had just moved. I'd just re-triggered the trap that had killed him. If I hadn't seen the body, I might have died in the same way. His eyes stared open in disbelief. I thought I recognized him from the line outside, but I was probably fooling myself. There were hundreds of candidates. I had always known these tests had the potential to be fatal, but somehow, seeing this had finally made it real. I leaned down and closed his eyes, shaking my head. I'm sorry you died like this. I hope your spirit finds peace. They were hollow words, and I knew it. I searched through what he was carrying. It wouldn't do him any good now. There wasn't much of use. He was wearing a sword and dagger on his belt. The dagger looked valuable, with the hilt being carved into a golden lion's head. I left them both, instead taking the glove off his right hand. It had an unfamiliar symbol embroidered on it in gold, similar to my own glove. A family symbol. I slipped it into my bag. I'd look for them. I could feel the eyes of the prisoners on me, but I didn't care. I continued going through his belongings, searching the pouches at his side. Food, water, a candle, a key, blue in color. I took the key, putting it in my pack, and carefully made my way over to the crystalline walls of the cells. Hear me? I caught the voice of the woman. She was a bit muffled, but audible. I watched every step as I approached, and just in case, I scanned the ceiling as well. I found a few more trap panels on the floor, but nothing visible on the roof. I can hear you, I said at normal volume. She nodded, and the black-haired man finally moved, approaching the corner of his cell where he could get closest to us. Good. Don't do anything yet. She looked like she was talking loudly, nearly yelling. I could hear her a little better now that I was close. Don't touch the walls. I had been just about to touch the walls. Okay, I said. What's going on here? The masked man tapped a fist on the inside of his wall. Crystalline structure. Nearly unbreakable. I could manage it, but the cells are warded. If I broke mine, the wards on the other two would trigger defenses. Warded? I glanced at the crystalline walls more carefully, narrowing my eyes. I wasn't attuned yet, but I could see some hints of blue energy within the crystalline structure. They looked almost like hovering letters. Yep, warded. Listen closely, the woman said. I'm Vera Corrington. If you help me get out of here, I can help get you nearly anything. You should help the kid, the man cut in. He's been unconscious for nearly 2 days. Dehydrated, most likely. Don't be a fool. Vera glanced at the masked man. The child has no chance of making it out on his own, and the key is only going to work once. I frowned, looking at Vera. Exactly which key do you mean? Vera folded her arms. The blue one you found on that poor bastard's body. There should be locks outside each of our cells, but these things eat keys. You won't be able to help all of us. The masked man walked to the center of his cell, tapping a part on the wall. I could just barely see a keyhole there, now that he was indicating it. Resh. 1 key, 3 locks. Was this a part of the test? It easily could be seen that way if I broke it down into component parts. A dead body to indicate the traps. I could only free 1 person. The obvious option, the child, might already be dead and a waste of a key. A man and a woman were the other options, maybe to appeal to people of the opposite gender? Or, of course, it could actually be a prison. Had I found a place in the tower I wasn't supposed to be? It seemed unlikely. The goddess was supposed to observe everything in the tower and guide our paths, at least according to legend. Was it possible that the prison was real, but that the goddess had guided me here? To give me a chance to free one of them? Or maybe all of them? There were too many things I didn't know. I had to treat the situation as real, meaning that I was actually being given a chance to free someone who was trapped in the tower. Someone like Tristan. Has either of you met someone named Tristan? Another prisoner, maybe? The 2 adults looked at each other, and then both shook their heads. The masked man spoke. Others have come and gone, but I haven't heard of anyone by that name. Vera jerked a thumb at the man. This guy would know. He's been in here for weeks, if you believe his stories. And he can survive longer, too, which is why you should free me. I sighed. Shouldn't have hoped for anything this soon. I just need to stick to the plan and make the climb to the top. In the meantime, maybe I can help someone else. I scratched my chin. Truthfully, I wasn't certain I should free anyone. If they were here, wasn't that the goddess's will? Thinking that way wasn't going to get me anywhere, though. If everything here was part of the goddess's plan, freeing them was just as likely to be what Celise wanted. And if the goddess wanted people my age to bleed out on the floors of her towers, well, I wasn't certain I could trust her judgment. It was a blasphemous way to think, but Tristan's disappearance had changed me. I looked at the masked man. Not making any argument for me to free you? He shook his head. That child is dying. Vera is right when she says it may be too late. But I wouldn't want it on my conscience if he died when he could be saved. I nodded. I couldn't disagree with that reasoning. Tall, dark, and shady over there has a point, but he's not mentioning another possibility. He's not all that attached to me. Might be that if you free the kid, he'll break out of his own cell and make me dead. The masked man shook his head. You're paranoid. She tilted her head to the side. A few days stuck with you, and anyone would be. What are the 2 of you doing in here anyway? I folded my arms. What is this place? Vera sighed, running fingers through greasy hair. Stepped in a place I shouldn't have. Happens to Delvers all the time. I frowned. Delvers? The masked man spoke next. A fancy term for looters. Vera gave a crooked smile, highlighting a scar across her upper lip. I prefer treasure hunter. She rolled her eyes. Anyway, there are traps all over these towers. Some of them are merciful enough to be fatal,
Others set off alarms or drop you into places like this. It was the first for me. The second for this Karas over here. Karas bristled. If by dropped you mean teleported, I wouldn't get caught in a mere pit. Right. Sure you wouldn't. Anyway, we're equally stuck, but you're the wanted criminal. Vera turned back to me.
And if you let the kid out, there are good odds he's going to cut himself loose, which is a shame, because all the fire and lightning from those wards is going to be terrible for my complexion. If people like them could get caught and imprisoned here, there's a good chance it's happened to others. That makes the odds Tristan is still alive somewhat higher, but I don't know how long someone could survive in a cell like this. Vera's argument made me nervous, but I couldn't just leave a child to die. I moved toward the child's cell with the utmost care and raised the key. Thank you, Keras said. I glanced at him. After I free the child, stay there. If you try to break yourself out while Vera is still in her cell, I'll deliberately trigger every trap I can to make sure you never walk out of here. He nodded. I understand. Vera let out a low hiss. I don't like this. You'd better know what you're doing, kid. I glanced to her. I'm pretty sure I do. One question, though. How do you know it's the blue key that opens these doors? She shrugged. It's the same color the jailer uses. Why? I pointed at the lock. The keyhole is gray. Could they accept other keys, maybe? Vera nodded. There's a chance, but other keys might also trigger the wards. It'd be a risk. I nodded, considering, as I turned the blue key in the lock. A section of the wall vanished entirely, taking the key with it. That explained how the key was used up, as they explained. I didn't step inside the cell immediately. It could have easily been another trap. I removed my rope from my backpack and tried to get the lasso around the kid's waist. Vera quirked an eyebrow. Seriously? I get that you're cautious, kid, but that seems like overkill. A lack of caution is why we're in these cells, Vera. Keras leaned on the wall next to her cell. Speak for yourself. My room wasn't even remotely fair. So she'd failed the challenge and ended up here. Could Tristan have done the same and ended up in another prison? It was a chance, not a good chance, but a possibility. If he was alive, that meant that asking the goddess for the boon of returning him would be much more likely to succeed. People said the goddess could raise the dead, but I didn't know of any confirmed cases, just legends. I clung to that hope as I managed, barely, to get the lasso around the kid's waist. You're going to hurt him. That was Vera speaking, which was interesting. She hadn't sounded all that concerned about the kid before. I turned back toward Vera. You really want me to step in there? There's a chance the wall will close behind me, or that it'll trigger another trap. At least move him slowly, yeah? I nodded, inspecting the floor carefully before I dragged the boy's body across it. The cell wasn't large, so it didn't take me long to get him outside. I gingerly picked him up and set him on a non-trapped part of the floor, then turned him over. His chest still rose and fell. His lips, however, were cracked and torn. I didn't really know how to feed an unconscious kid water. Maybe one of the others in the cells did, though. I stood up, brandishing my red key. Vera narrowed her eyes at me. Now where'd you get a thing like that? Room with a valor board. I turned to Keras. You seem to understand the wards. I take it you're attuned? In a manner of speaking. That's not important. I do understand the wards for the most part. Enigmatic, but sufficient. All right. Can you determine if an incorrect key will trigger the wards? He knelt by his own keyhole, examining the crystal. I don't believe so. I quirked a brow. You don't believe? I'm not an expert at this style of warding. Not good. Okay, do you think the explosion would kill people outside the cells if the wards are triggered? He shook his head. No. They are a fail-safe for destroying prisoners. The jailer would need to be able to do it and remain safe from right outside. I looked to Vera. Do you know anything that would contradict what he's saying? No, he's a little scary, but I think he knows what he's talking about. So, if you're going to free one of us... I looked back to Keras. If I freed Vera, would you be able to break yourself out and survive the resulting explosion? He nodded once. Before you do that, Vera stepped away from her cell door. I should probably remind you that he's a wanted criminal. Keras put a hand to his forehead. I'm just a foreigner, Vera. That doesn't automatically make me a criminal. I'm just saying, innocent people don't usually run around in masks. A fair point. And if he was a criminal, getting him to swear he wasn't going to harm us wouldn't really mean much. I wasn't confident that freeing everyone was the right choice, but I was even less confident I was going to make it out of here on my own while trying to care for an injured child. Keras, I'm Corin. You want to tell me what your side of the story is? I was humanizing myself, trying to diminish the chance he'd murder me the second he got out. Not now. That was not a good answer. But if you get me out of here, I'll tell you when we're out of the tower. An implication that we'd be leaving together. I could work with that. I made my way over to Vera's cell, holding the red key. You both okay with taking this risk? I could see a hint of fear in Vera's expression, but she hid it well. I think I'll die of boredom if I don't take this chance, so, yeah, go for it. The masked man just nodded. I put the key in the lock. Nothing happened. I tried to turn the key, and it didn't budge. Well, that was anticlimactic. Vera sighed loudly. I put the red key back in my back and withdrew the gold one. Vera blinked at me. Do you just have a bag full of keys or something? I shook my head. Last one. I'd been hoping to hold on to the gold key, since it had been the one coded to the path I'd been taking so far. Still, I couldn't in good conscience leave without trying it. I tried the gold key. It turned. The door to Vera's cell vanished. She blinked, hesitantly reaching a hand into the space outside. A broad grin spread over her face as her hand exited the cell. She stepped outside, grabbing me in a hug. Ooh, yes! Freedom! Thanks, kid! I may have blushed. I turned my head toward the masked man. I didn't see him move. The space where he'd been blurred, and I heard the sound of metal ringing against stone. A section of the wall of his chamber had been cut away, leaving nothing but a pile of cleanly sliced rubble where it had once stood. Keras's weapon was already sheathed again. I never saw it in his hand. Holy goddess. What? There was no sign of triggering the wards Keras had mentioned. Had he been lying? Or were the wards simply disabled because two of the doors were already open? I couldn't be sure. We should leave. Keras moved out of the cell with deliberate slowness. He stepped over the trap that had killed my predecessor, moving to the child's side and kneeling down. He looked at me. Do you have water? I nodded, fumbling for my backpack, and withdrew a flask. I tossed it to him without a second thought. He caught it, of course. Vera watched the whole exchange with narrowed eyes. Keras uncapped the bottle, tilting the young boy's head at an angle. Then he opened the child's mouth and poured water down his throat. The boy coughed, but he swallowed some of the water. A good sign, I hoped. I was never very good at medicinal matters. The masked man tossed the flask back toward me. I missed the catch, but Vera caught it. Mind if I take a swig? I shook my head. She drank deeply from the flask, making a satisfied sound, and then handed it back to me. I replaced the flask in my bag, looking back to her. There's some water on the body, too. I didn't take it. Vera knelt down next to the corpse, taking the bag that carried his food and water. Thanks, this'll be useful. She looked nervous. I felt the same way. Come. Keras knelt down, picking up the unconscious child. He draped the kid over his shoulder and stood back up, leading the way out of the room. Vera and I carefully avoided the trapped spots on the floor, following him into the hallway. He walked quickly, which let Vera and me deliberately fall a bit behind. I turned my head to her. You know much about him? She lifted her hands and shrugged. He was in there a lot longer than I was, from what I understand. I've only been here a few days, thank the goddess. Seen him do a few more magic tricks in his cell. Not sure what his attunement is. I've never seen anything like that sword trick, cutting stone. I thought on it. My best guess? He had multiple attunements. That was rare, but not unheard of. Maybe the Legionnaire attunement and something related to swords? But that wouldn't explain his speed. 3 attunements? Practically unheard of, but I couldn't think of a better explanation. I'd have to get more information first. He's a delver, like you are? She shook her head. Pretty sure he's not. A climber, probably. I knew that term. It meant someone who was trying to reach the top of the tower. There were legends that anyone who reached the top of one of the 6 shifting spires would receive a blessing from Celise, and that someone who conquered all 6 towers would be lifted into the skies to reside with the Visages. Most people didn't take the latter legend seriously, but there were plenty of people who claimed that they had reached the top of a tower and been given something by one of the Visages. Wealth, enchanted items, maybe even an additional attunement. The stories varied from person to person. It was likely there was something at the top. The promise of a divine reward was a tremendous temptation. There were hundreds of climbers in each city, many of whom already had attunements. Climbers entered through different gates than the one used for judgments, so they could go inside in groups. Sane people kept their groups to a half dozen or so, though. The tower punished anything it saw as a threat, and everyone knew the stories about what had happened when it did. The kingdom of Feria had once tried to invade the 5th tower. It was nothing but dust and ruins now. We continued walking down the hallway. In the limited time before we reached the next room, I'd have to gather as much information as I could. Do you think he's a danger to us? Vera shrugged. Of course, but we're still better off following in his wake. I raised an eyebrow. Why is that? She put a hand on the nearby wall. Because we just broke out of a prison, so this is a threat to us, too. The tower doesn't like it when you break the rules. I frowned. You make it sound like the tower is sapient. How else do you explain the constantly changing layout? The treasures that appear for one person who completes a challenge, but not another. Do you really think Celise is watching every room and every tower simultaneously, hand-picking who gets attunements and resculpting chambers? I tend to lean toward Burmer's spectral theory of tower design. Oh, you're a little scholar. How adorable. I haven't read that one, so you're going to have to fill me in. Incorporeal minions, essentially. Dozens of them for each tower. Vera nodded, running a hand through her hair again. She looked disheveled, which was unsurprising if she'd been here for days. Yeah, I could see that. Amounts to about the same thing as a thinking tower, though. Sort of. If there are multiple entities, they might have to communicate with each other, which means some routes might be safer than others. And maybe they wouldn't all be in agreement on how to handle us. She gestured toward Keras. Looks like we're about out of time, kid. Keras reached the door at the end of the hall. I rushed forward just as the door opened, remembering the trap a moment too late. The pendulum arced through the doorway, thousands of pounds of swinging stone. Keras's hand blurred. The sphere, now sliced into a dozen pieces, clattered harmlessly across the floor. I blinked. I really need to stop being surprised by what he can do. I'd seen a lot of attuned using magically enhanced swordsmanship over the years. My father took me to watch tournaments on a regular basis, both ones he competed in and otherwise. I'd seen championship bouts between experienced veterans. A lot of them had been fast. Keras was definitely faster. I'd been paying attention this time, and I still hadn't seen him draw his weapon. I fell back to where Vera was inching forward. So, if he does decide he doesn't like us, do you think you could handle him? Vera made a half snort, half laugh, and slowly shook her head. No, kid. I'm attuned too, but I'm not a monster like that. I'm not even specialized in fighting.
My hands flexed in the air. Well, at least if he decides to kill us, he'd probably do it quickly. So bleak, she noted. Let's focus on the positives, yeah? Looks like he's solving the room for us. Keras was, in fact, solving the room by slicing the other pendulums in the same way he had the first. When he was done with those, he grabbed the swinging scythe by the bottom, stopping it without difficulty. He yanked downward, breaking the chain that attached it to the ceiling. The blade fell to the floor. I looked back at Vera.
I'm pretty sure we were supposed to use those pendulums to break through the crystal sections on the walls. She waved one hand back and forth dismissively. It won't be a problem. We made it into the room, stepping over the rubble from the destroyed traps, and watched as Keras moved to the red crystal section on the wall. Another blur in front of him, with no obvious immediate impact this time. When he kicked forward, a large section of wall fell away. Not just red crystal, the solid stone surrounding it fell away. Enough that a crude doorway had formed in its wake. I couldn't see anything but blackness beyond it. He walked through and vanished. I looked at the other crystal sections on the floor and ceiling. We could split up from him here. I patted the dueling cane on my hip. I think there's a good chance I could blast through that floor section. She shook her head. As dangerous as Keras is, he's our best chance of making it through here alive. Come on. Gotta follow him before the rooms shift. She grabbed my hand, leading me forward. While she led me by the hand, I processed her statement. Would the rooms change while we were inside them? I hadn't seen that happen, but it wasn't impossible. In fact, with a large enough number of people inside the towers, it seemed likely that it had to happen on occasion. I'd have to research that more when I got the chance. Vera vanished the moment she hit the boundary between rooms. It looked as holding hands hadn't caused me to be included in the teleportation effect. I briefly wondered how Keras and the kid he was carrying had been affected, since they had appeared to vanish together. Was it based on consciousness? Or maybe proximity? Either way, I was alone amid the shattered traps. Another window to break off from the group if I wanted to. Vera had warned me about the shifting rooms, but I figured I could spare a few seconds to try to get some more information. I hastily pulled the book out of my backpack. I probably wasn't going to get another chance at this. You are in one of the tower's holding chambers. Do not interact with the prisoners. Leave immediately. The people contained within the cells are not to be trusted. I flipped to the next page. That was a mistake. You are risking a great deal, Corin, and I will not be able to protect you if you continue down this path. No one is placed in a chamber like that one without a good reason. And the next? You are in the room of arcs, or what remains of it. You see now the power of one of the people you have freed. Recapturing them would be beyond your present abilities. Your best hope is to escape them. That was not reassuring. I wrote a brief reply. Thank you. Why are you helping me? And slammed the book shut. I would read more when time permitted. I stepped into the next room. I arrived in what looked more like a noble's manor than another chamber of the tower. The walls were painted white and adorned with paintings and hanging weapons. At roughly equal intervals between the paintings were standing suits of armor with intricate etchings of silver and gold. 3 crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling high above, each with a differently colored central crystal that bathed a section of the room with light. The way the lights overlapped made the room an effect that I imagined looked something like a rainbow. I wasn't sure because I'd never actually seen a rainbow, but I understood the concept. Pretty. It was a fleeting thought, and one that was unusual for me, but the mixtures of lights pleased me in a visceral way. I shook my head to dismiss the thought. I had more important things to be thinking about. I was standing on a plush red carpet, which covered a path with 3 branches. The left and right paths led to identical double doors, tall and wooden. The central path led up a carpeted stairway. The central chamber was huge. I was probably 100 feet from the stairway or either of the other exits. Keras stood at the base of the stairs in a low stance, his hand on the hilt of his weapon. The unconscious boy was lying nearby. 4 tall pillars reached toward the ceiling, and Vera was currently taking cover behind one of them. I could see why. We were not alone. At the top of the stairs was a figure in golden armor. He was at least 7 feet tall, a crystalline sword held in his right hand. Feathered wings stretched from his back, flexing in the air, spanning a width greater than the figure's height. A visible aura of scintillating light emanated from his body. His blonde hair was cut in a short military style, his face perfectly a sculpted image of masculine valor. Katashi, the visage of valor, barred our path. It could have been a trick, an illusion, a shape-shifting monster, a simulacrum. It didn't matter. I wasn't willing to risk confronting even the shadow of a god. I rushed to the same pillar Vera was standing behind. Might want to find a different spot, kid. We're kind of making ourselves a target if we're in the same place. Right. I just go right back out into the open. Maybe in a minute? Maybe not. What did I miss? Oh, you know, just a visage of the goddess appearing in a flash of fire and thunder. Nothing big. Her voice was tense, despite the levity of her words. Any idea? The visage took a step forward. I felt the entire room vibrate as he moved. His presence hung like a shroud in the air, pushing me down and forcing the breath from my lungs. Vera and I braced ourselves against the nearby pillar. Keras remained standing with no apparent difficulty, raising a hand to scratch his chin. I would appreciate it if you'd stop that. You are not welcome here, interloper. Katashi waved his right hand toward Keras. I was barely able to discern the blur that appeared in the air as he made the gesture. Keras flew backward like he'd been hit by a train, slamming into one of the support pillars with an audible crack and falling to the floor. I winced at the impact. Keras picked himself up, dusting off his coat. It was only as he stepped forward that I saw thick cracks along the surface of the pillar where he'd struck. A collision with enough force to crack a pillar should have shattered a human's bones into mush. I briefly considered the possibility that Keras was some sort of artificial construct made of a substance harder than stone, but he moved too quickly and smoothly for that explanation to be likely. Maybe he was protected by some sort of barrier, but that didn't explain the damage to the pillar itself. Did he have some method of manipulating kinetic energy? I'd never heard of an attunement for that, but it wasn't impossible. I turned my head toward Vera. You wouldn't happen to have any way of protecting us, would you? She snorted. Duck and hide, kid. Duck and hide. I ducked and hid. Meanwhile, the visage had tilted his head to the side, confusion on his face. How do you remain unharmed? Keras raised his gaze from his clothing to the visage before him. Trade secret, he replied. There was a moment of pause before he spoke again. Are we done now? His voice was exasperated. Can we have a conversation? The visage stood a little taller, his expression dark. Talk. Thank you, Keras said. You are one of the ones they call visages, correct? Katashi gave the slightest nod. Katashi. They've been calling me Keras here. Does your goddess hear what you hear? Does she see what you see? The visage turned his head to the side. I have no reason to answer that. Keras frowned. I mean you and your people no harm. I was hoping to get a message through to your goddess. Katashi made a broad gesture, indicating the room. You tear away pieces of a sacred place, then seek to speak to the goddess? Your insolence is astounding. Was that a problem? Keras scratched the back of his head, looking sheepish. I was told that we could make the way up the tower any way we wanted. Cutting through the walls to make your own entrances and exits is not a respectful method, outsider. They were talking now, which was good, and the pressure from Katashi's whatever he was doing seemed to have lessened. I turned my eyes to the unconscious boy, still at the base of the stairs. If they resumed fighting, which seemed likely, he was extraordinarily vulnerable. Speaking up now, with tensions high, was probably a terrible move. I didn't really know what I was getting into here. Katashi kept calling Keras an interloper, and I wasn't quite sure what that implied. Someone from outside the city? Or, thinking bigger, maybe someone from outside the continent? The latter was supposed to be impossible, given the continent-wide barrier that we had in place, but people didn't usually break stone pillars when they collided either. Terrible move or not, it was probably my best chance of keeping that poor kid alive. I stepped out from around the pillar, lowering my head to the carpet in supplication. It was a familiar gesture, one I'd done at shrines to the goddess 1,000 times as a youth, though I'd fallen out of practice since Tristan's disappearance. I'd never prayed directly to a visage, of course. I'd never seen a visage before, not even from a distance. Great visage of Celise, forgive me for my insolence in speaking to you without permission. I was amidst my judgment when I stumbled on these people, and beg your leave to take the unconscious child and continue in my tests. Katashi turned to me. I kept my eyes low, not daring to meet his gaze. Your respect is a credit to your bloodline, scion of House Cadence. I will consider your request. Assist me and you may earn my blessing. I pressed my head further into the carpet. Thank you, Great Visage. How may I assist you? I felt the pressure lift from my shoulders. Breath swam into my lungs. I lifted my head, noting that Katashi had turned back toward Keras. The visage pointed at Keras. Do not allow this one to escape. Oh, curse it all. The last thing I wanted was to get involved in a battle between these two, at least one of which literally had deific levels of power. Nevertheless, if I didn't act at all, now I risked antagonizing the visage. That couldn't possibly end well. I was shaking as I stood up, unclipping the dueling cane from my belt. I looked at Vera. She shook her head at me vehemently. I sighed, walking to take a position near the doorway on the left side of the room. I chose that exit because it was the furthest from where the combatants stood, meaning that it was the spot where I was least likely to be a victim of collateral damage. I tried to position myself in alignment with one of the pillars, so that it could also serve as a shield. If Keras came for me, I didn't like my odds of being able to stop him. I thought of the nearby door with wistful longing, but I didn't even know if I could open it. It wasn't like I could check without enraging the visage. I could have sided with Keras, of course. He had survived Katashi's opening moves. There was a possibility he had the upper hand in this conflict. But both my gut and my common sense told me that was unlikely. Keras was terrifyingly strong, one of a dozen people on the continent who might have had more than 2 attunements. The visage, though, he'd have all of them, including some that no human had access to. Scholars argued about how many total attunements existed, but the best guess was at least 50, each providing a broad variety of abilities associated with a particular theme. Their benefits were cumulative, so someone with 2 defensive attunements would be extraordinarily resilient. With 50 attunements? Well, I mentioned the broken kingdom of Feria before. Its destruction had taken the Visage of Law less than a day. The Visage of Valor gave me a nod, apparently approving of my position. There was still another exit to block, but Vera wasn't moving for it. She stayed behind the pillar, giving herself as much cover as possible. Her eyes were scanning everywhere, searching for openings, opportunities. I would prefer not to bring other people into this. Keras folded his arms. And moreover, I would rather not fight at all. It was somewhat endearing that Keras was still trying to reach a diplomatic solution, even if it probably was just to save his hide. I felt bad about standing in his way. It was a small betrayal, even if it was mostly symbolic. Sorry, I mumbled. I think he heard me. I hoped he did. Katashi lowered his weapon, shaking his head. Though it may seem contrary to my title, I do not relish battle. Nevertheless, you are a threat to the residents of this tower, and I cannot permit that. If it is any consolation, I will make your end quick." Keras turned his head down, shaking slightly. It took me a few seconds to realize that he was laughing. As he looked upward, a grin spread across his face. "It never can be easy, can it?" Keras turned his head toward where Vera still hid behind the pillar. "Get the kid out of the way before we start this." Vera began to move, but Katashi spoke a single word. "No." "No? Why wouldn't Katashi want the kid to be clear of the battlefield?" I raised the dueling cane, my hand still aching from my earlier uses of the weapon, pulling mana through my veins. I was no longer pointing it toward Keras. I hoped I wouldn't have to use it. Several things happened at once. Vera broke from cover, rushing toward the fallen child. Katashi raised his left hand with his palm forward, golden light forming in his grasp. His palm was pointed at Vera. Keras moved. He was a blur, impossible for my ordinary eyes to discern. When a twisting helix of light ripped forward from Katashi's hand, Keras appeared in front of Vera, deflecting the blast with a casual swipe of his own left hand. "Go!" Vera grabbed the child and lifted him over her shoulder, moving toward me with almost painful slowness. Katashi's jaw tightened. "I did not permit." Keras was next to him in an instant, smashing a fist into the visage's armored chest. I saw a blast of concussive force on the impact, a spherical wave of disruption. Katashi took a single step back at the impact, his expression unchanged. Keras flickered back just in time to avoid a slash from the visage's crystalline blade. When Keras reappeared, I realized the left sleeve of his coat had been burned away where the blast of light had connected. The skin beneath was burned and cracked. He might be faster and stronger than me, but Keras isn't invincible. This isn't an even fight. It's not even close. What could I do to alter the outcome? I didn't even know what they were fighting about, let alone their strengths and weaknesses. If a visage of the goddess said someone needed to die, conventional wisdom said that they needed to die. But conventional wisdom had also abandoned my brother in this same tower. Conventional wisdom and I hadn't been on speaking terms since then. That single punch from Keras looked like it had carried more force than anything I could put out from my dueling cane, and it had barely affected the visage. I knew how to pour additional mana into a burst, but I doubted I'd have an impact. Katashi fought armies, some of which contained attuned. A cheap shot to the head? The lack of armor might have made a difference, but I couldn't count on my ability to land the shot. What else did I have at my disposal? I shrugged off my backpack and found the book. By the time I looked back, Katashi was surrounded by a flickering aura of burning light. He pointed his crystalline weapon at Vera. I could see the fiery aura gather in his left hand, then flow through his body, glowing brighter until it gathered in his sword, turning the blade white. This must be. There was no inflection in his words. Vera wasn't moving fast enough to avoid the helix of incendiary light that emerged from the blade. Keras blurred again. A streak of silver severed the air, splitting the bolt of light in twain. The deflected energy smashed into the floor, leaving long cracks in the marble. The swordsman stood a little straighter, his expression grim. The sword he held was long enough to be used in two hands, but he held it with his right with no sign of effort. The silvery blade had only a slim, flat surface toward the center. The outer portions angled into viciously sharp edges. A subtle white glow flowed within the blade, a clear sign of an enchantment. I doubted it would be enough. I set my dueling cane down, letting Vera approach while I grabbed my quill and flipped through the book to the end. You have reached the entrance to the second floor of the tower. You must flee. The visage will not permit you to leave with the prisoners. You don't stand a chance. You're not reading this right now, but if you do, please leave. Please, while you can. That ink was dry, but new writing appeared as I watched. The visage will not be distracted for long. You must leave. I raised the quill to write. You're clearly watching here. Can you help us? No words appeared in the seconds that followed. Keras shrugged off his coat, revealing a black vest crossed with leather straps. 6 sheathed knives were attached to the straps on his back. He kicked his coat to the side, drawing one of the knives with his left hand. Katashi remained at the top of the stairway, turning his gaze toward Keras and maintaining an impassive expression. He jammed his crystalline sword into the stone floor, bringing his hands in front of him. Globes of flame appeared in the air around him, one after another, spinning and rotating. Keras flipped the knife in his hand and hurled it straight at the visage's face. The visage didn't even move. The knife impacted an invisible barrier and clattered harmlessly to the ground. Keras gave the slightest frown. The burning orbs did move. They weren't as quick as the lightning, moving only at the speed of a thrown ball. But there were 8 of them, and they had different targets. Seeing Keras's expression sink, I knew that he couldn't stop them all. Vera had almost reached me. The dueling cane was in my hand before I processed what I was doing. 2 clicks in rapid succession. I felt the mana surge through my chest, burning hotter than it ever had. I blew the 2 closest spheres of flame out of the air, dispersing them with kinetic force. Keras moved quickly enough to slash 5 of the others, successfully deflecting the last of the projectiles aimed for Keras and the child. The last sphere struck him in the back. The force of the impact barely staggered him, but his vest ignited instantly. He shivered for a moment, wincing, and reached toward his back with his left hand. The flames pulled away, gathering in his hand. A wave of his hand across the blade of his sword. The flames swept across the weapon's edges shifting to glow crimson. I could see the burned skin across his back as he rushed toward the stairs. He was still fast, faster than anyone I'd seen before. But I could see him. He was slowing down, the wounds weighing on him more than his expression showed. I looked back at the book. I will try, child. I will try. You must leave the room. He didn't have to tell me twice. Vera, we need to go. Vera gave me a curt nod, shifting the burden on her back. The boy was nearly as tall as she was. I was surprised she could carry him at all. I flipped the book and quill into the pack. Katashi turned his head. He'd heard me, but Keras had nearly flown up the stairs. He didn't have time to intervene. The door behind me opened. Vera pushed through. I gave a last look toward Keras. He'd reached the top of the stairs. He waved his left hand, and the 5 remaining daggers slipped out of their scabbards, floating in the air behind him. As I watched, their blades extended as they hovered in formation. They were wings of steel. He gripped the hilt of his weapon with 2 hands, the blade still glowing with inner light. I took a deep breath, retrieving my backpack as the swordsmen began to circle each other, and I fled the room. Chapter 4. Escape. My right hand was trembling as I gripped the hilt of the dueling cane. Part of it was the pain from drawing too much mana, but a larger part was my state of mind. I'd sided with a prisoner against a visage of the goddess, and I didn't feel guilt. I felt like I should have done more. I'd left Keras behind. I shook my head, trying to regain my focus. Nothing in this tower was safe, and if Keras did fall, I had little doubt that the visage would follow us and finish what he had started. This room was rectangular, maybe 40 feet across. It was clearly divided into sections that were about 10 feet each section being elevated a bit above the previous section. I could see a few tiles in each section that were just a sliver thicker than they should have been, probably traps. There were dozens of fist-sized holes on the side walls of the room, probably more traps. Those weren't the real problem, though. Each of those elevated sections in front of us had a set of monsters, and each was more dangerous than the last. And, predictably, the sole visible exit was on the opposite side of the room. The monsters in the section right in front of us were the simplest threats possible. Teardrop-shaped creatures of gelatinous acid, barely intelligent. Slimes. They were already hopping forward. Behind them,
2 massive creatures that resembled bears, but with brown scales and 3 vicious horns. Bargensi. They were extremely resistant to physical damage, but magic would work, including my dueling cane. Unfortunately, I could barely even hold it at this point. There was a cylindrical pillar in that section, right between the Bargensi. It wasn't solid stone like the other ones in the previous room. It was some kind of transparent, crystalline structure. Maybe just thick glass, but I doubted I'd be that lucky. Inside the pillar, I could see a sheathed sword floating in what looked like mid-air.
At a second glance, I realized my mistake. The sword was submerged in water. Finally, right in front of the door, an 8-foot-tall bronze statue. It had 6 arms, and each arm carried a different weapon. Its eyes were glowing with crimson light. Pretty sure that's a Spire Guardian. Spire Guardians were deadly monsters that guarded the ways up to higher floors of the tower. I wasn't supposed to have to face any during the judgment. They were strong enough to fight fully trained attuned. I knew I didn't stand a chance by myself. Vera glanced at the slimes, then back to me. Switch. I understood her meaning immediately, slipping the dueling cane into her grip and lifting the child out of her arms. I didn't know what level of skill she had with the weapon, but it was our best chance. Vera swept her arm across the room, rapidly tapping the button on the hilt as she moved. Blasts of force rippled out of the cane's tip and slammed into an invisible barrier at the boundary between our section and the one in front of us. Vera grimaced. Should have known it wouldn't be that easy. I'll have to get up there to take care of those. Wait here for now, yeah? I nodded as Vera crept ahead. She ducked at the border of one of the raised tiles and felt along the side of it. Fortunately, she didn't press it down, but I had no idea what she was doing. Something to do with her attunement, maybe? Some kind of trap disarming magic? I didn't see any visible effect when she moved away from the tile. She did something similar along the wall, putting her hand right up against one of the sides of the holes. Then, after a moment, she stuck her hand inside. She pulled it back out a moment later. She turned her head back toward me. Don't step on the raised tiles. I'm pretty sure I could have guessed that on my own. Right. Then she stepped on the tile closest to her. She didn't. I stepped backward out of instinct, but it wasn't necessary. The traps weren't aimed at me. A hail of arrows fired out from the holes in the wall directly in line with Vera. She just grinned, stepped forward, and caught one of the arrows with her offhand as they whizzed by. She tilted her head to the side after the flurry subsided, inspecting the arrow. Yeah, these'll do. Then she charged. She leapt onto the next raised section without resistance. Apparently that barrier was only meant to stop magic, not people. As she landed, the slimes hopped toward her with surprising speed. She blasted the first one with the dueling cane 3 times, then stepped backward as it recoiled, triggering another trap. Vera dodged the incoming arrows again. The slimes didn't. The arrows took care of 3 of them. The sole slime she'd already bombarded wasn't airborne, so it was low enough to the ground that it didn't get hit. Instead, it just sort of slid across the ground toward Vera until she blasted it twice more. Then it vanished, and the other slimes vanished along with it. Not bad. Vera wasn't done, though. She walked forward, avoiding the rest of the traps on that section, and came to rest next to the next one. Move up, she instructed me. I complied quickly, but I moved slowly, both because I was carrying someone else that was almost my size, and because I really didn't want to set off an arrow trap. I made it to the next section without incident. Great. Vera hopped onto the Bargensi platform. The Bargensi charged. Vera took a couple shots at the lead Bargensi, then tried to step back down to where I was to avoid being barreled over by the still charging monster. That, it seemed, was not allowed. The barrier popped into existence, and she bounced off it, stumbling backward. She managed to regain her footing, but the lead Bargensi was almost on top of her. I set the child down and dug into my pack, but I was far too slow to help. The Bargensi opened its jaws as it closed in. Vera jumped, pressing the other switch on the dueling cane and landing on the creature's back. It was pretty impressive, but she fell right off. Not a combat attunement indeed.
The Bargensi turned as she fell, rearing up to smash down on top of her. I did the only thing I could think of to help. I threw the candle from my bag at the tile closest to them. It wasn't very heavy, but I hoped. The trap triggered. Vera, still on the floor, was still too low for the arrows to hit her. The Bargensi, standing tall, was not so lucky. In seconds, the first Bargensi was riddled with arrows. It fell backward rather than forward and stilled as it struck the ground. The second Bargensi, however, was unharmed. Vera rolled as it approached, avoiding its charge, and jammed the blade of the dueling cane into its side. The creature roared, turning toward her, and she fired a blast of mana into its open mouth. The creature shuddered and collapsed, lifeless. Vera pushed herself to her feet. Thanks for the assist there. That'd have been a lot messier otherwise. My eyes were fixed on the second Bargensi's corpse, and my hand drifted up toward my throat. I wondered what it felt like to swallow a blast like that. I shook it off. Glad to help. Can you get back down now that those things are dead? She tested it. She could. Guess we can probably move freely in and out of any section we've cleared. I pointed at the kid. Should I put him back at the entrance and help you with that guy then? I indicated the bronze statue. He looks pretty mean. It might have been my imagination, but I was pretty sure it turned its head toward us when I said that. That was disconcerting. Not sure if that's a good idea. You still don't have an attunement. But I'm not going to refuse help if you insist. After seeing her almost get mauled back there, I insist.
She helped me move the kid back to the entrance, and then we stepped back to where the Bargensi had fallen. I turned my head to her. You fought anything like that before? She shook her head. No, but it'll probably be tough to crack with physical attacks. Doubt the arrows will do much. Maybe the sword in there is special? I'd considered the same. Maybe the book knew more, but I was worried about taking the time to send a message and await a response. Probably worth trying to get it out at least, and if we can't, I can just try to distract it while you hit it with the dueling cane. Vera nodded. Sounds good. Let me see. She put her hand up against the pillar. Not glass, it's just thick ice. I think I can break it. I nodded, stepping out of the likely path of any water that the pillar might release. Go right ahead then. She stepped back too, then fired a shot from the dueling cane into the center of a pillar. A crack spread across the surface where the mana had connected. The statue moved. An echoing voice emerged from its mouth. Defilers! That didn't sound good. There was a grinding sound, then a crack as the statue's foot shattered the stone where it stepped. Vera shot the pillar again, broadening the crack. The statue bent its knees and leapt, right at Vera. Resh! Vera dodged out of the way as it descended, already beginning to swing its swords at her. She ducked a swing aimed at her head, blasting the statue in the chest in response, but it barely budged from the shot. The pillar was cracked, but the crystal still hadn't broken. I didn't have anything heavy to hit it with. Can you hit it again? I shouted to Vera. The statue turned toward me and hurled a sword in my direction. I just barely stepped out of the way in time. Realizing that might be a viable weapon, I rushed for the thrown sword, only for it to vanish as soon as it hit the opposite wall. I'm a little busy, Vera replied to my request, deflecting a sword with the dueling cane's blade. She was better with the weapon than I'd expected, swiftly deflecting 2 cuts from the statue with perfect precision, but it was overwhelming her with the sheer number of angles it could attack from. She stepped back, giving more ground, and barely avoided triggering another trap. I rushed back toward them, but I still didn't have a weapon. I'm going to regret this. I rammed myself shoulder first into the crack in the pillar. The ice caved on impact. I was bathed in freezing water and tiny fragments of frost. My dueling tunic protected me from the worst of it. None of the icy shards were pushed free with sufficient force to pierce through it, but the water was cold, and it hit me with sufficient force to push me to the ground. The statue turned toward me again, raising a hand, but Vera stepped in and slashed the arm with the dueling cane's blade. The sword arm went limp, a visible gash where the mana-charged blade had cut deep into it. That bought me a moment before it threw another sword at me with a different arm. I didn't have time to dodge. Instead, I raised the still-sheathed sword, which had flowed out of the water right next to me, and deflected the thrown blade out of the way. "Nice!" Vera shouted. I grinned, standing and drawing the weapon. It looked like a rusted piece of junk. That, I considered, is just what happens when I rely on hoping for the best. But, rusted junk or not, it was a weapon. I ran the statue anyway. The statue didn't deign to give me its attention this time. Vera had been forced all the way to the back wall, and she blasted it with mana in between parries. I hit the statue in the back. There was a loud clang, and my arm rattled from the impact, but it didn't do any visible damage. I did succeed in making it angry. The statue turned to face me, lashing out at me with 3 different swords. Fortunately, this was a game I knew how to play. I stepped left, deflecting one of the blades into the other 2, then kicked the statue in the knee. As I expected, it wasn't very well balanced. The statue stumbled backward, and I lashed out, landing a glancing blow across its face. Still no damage. It responded with a slash across my abdomen. I stepped back, failing to avoid it entirely, but my dueling tunic repelled the glancing blow. Then the blade of Vera's dueling cane burst through the back of its head, and the statue collapsed to the floor. I took a step back, breathing a sigh of relief. Whew! Vera leaned back against the wall, breathing heavily. "You can say that again, kid. I haven't had a fight like that in ages, and I don't care to have one again." I nodded, sheathing the sword and lifting it to show it to her. "You mind if I hold on to this thing?" "Nah," she dragged the word out into an exhale, still trying to get her breath back. "Think you earned it. Think you can carry the kid over here, though?" I set the sword down. "Yeah, you handled a lot more of the fighting. Only fair." "Thanks," she grinned at me. "You did pretty well yourself, though." I returned the grin, heading back to the other side of the room. I picked up the child gingerly. His condition seemed unchanged, and then carried him over to Vera, next to the door. As I returned, the monster shimmered and vanished as one, leaving tiny, colorful crystals behind in their wake. "Ooh, nice!" Vera picked up the largest crystal, the one that had been left behind by the statue, and shoved it into a pouch at her side. "May as well grab a few of these. I don't think we have that much time." I still knelt and snatched a single crystal from the remains of a bargency as I crossed the room. It was on my way, but I wasn't willing to deviate from the safe path to collect any others. The monsters might have been dead, but I still was worried about triggering a harder-to-see trap. Vera shrugged. "Suit yourself, kid." She walked to the door. The crystal on it was clear, and she touched it with her free hand. The door opened, displaying a round room with a single pillar at the center. A stone one this time, not another ice pillar. A shame, in spite of being doused with freezing water, I could have lived with more pillars that had treasure inside them. There were a few more obvious trap tiles on the floor, and one particularly foreboding iron chain leading to something on the opposite side of the pillar. I could see a large wooden door on the opposite side. "Looks like this is it." I recognized the double doors. They were the same design as the ones I had used to enter the tower. An exit. I allowed myself to take a breath of relief as I inched toward the door. "Looks like you're struggling there. Hand the kid back to me, yeah?" I nodded gratefully, arriving next to Vera and handing the unconscious boy back into her arms. I was sufficiently distracted with that motion that I just barely noticed when she pointed the dueling cane at my chest. "Don't move." My eyes narrowed. I strongly considered trying to grab the cane from her hand. My vest could probably take one more shot, and people had a tendency to miss charging targets at short range. But I'd never seen Vera miss. I opened my hands and stretched them out to my sides, a gesture of surrender. "Why?" "It's nothing personal. I don't know you, kid. But I've got to make sure my friend here is safe." Vera paused, grimacing. "I'm taking this way out. You can find your own way." Vera made a gesture with her head toward the door where we had entered the room. It was still there. Maybe you can explain things to the visage. I gave her a look that was heavy with skepticism. That sounds real plausible. Sorry, hate to do this, but I will fire if you follow me. This is bigger than you know. I shrugged.